Yeah, I can hear your voice, yeah. You can just turn the volume down and listen. Oh yeah, well maybe just come in here and listen then. Bring a chair.
Hello, and thank you for attending 2020 Sunstone's Digital Symposium Session 153, titled Other Scriptures, Grief, Gratitude, and the Haudenosaunee Great Peace. The audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available in the Whova app for approximately 3 months beginning at the end of August 2020. Please type any questions that you may have for our presenter into the Whova app, and they will be addressed at the end during a question and answer period. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There is more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. About this presentation. The arrival of a messenger who heralds an era of prolonged peace and equality may be one of the only events in the Book of Mormon attested to by external sources. In Haudenosaunee or Iroquois traditions, the Peacemaker and the Mother of Nations encourage ceremonies of condolence and thanksgiving, missing from the settler colonial narrative in the Book of Mormon. This presentation draws from decolonizing methodologies and Haudenosaunee oral tradition for an alternative native reading of this Latter-day Scriptural apogee. Let me introduce our speaker before we begin. Dr. Thomas W. Murphy is an anthropologist with European and Haudenosaunee heritage, best known for groundbreaking scholarship on DNA and the Book of Mormon. His recent work on indigenous issues in Latter-day Saint tradition has appeared in Decolonizing Mormonism, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, and Open Theology. I'm now going to give the floor to our presenter, Dr. Thomas W. Murphy.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I'm excited to be back here at Sunstone after an absence of 15 years. But before I start, I would like to acknowledge the Stahobes or Snohomish people on whose lands I reside in Western Washington, and who have welcomed my family into the community. These are photos I'm sharing of the Snohomish Tribal Council members and their grandchildren at Stolja Ali, Place of Medicine Ethnobotanical Garden in Gold Park, which we built together, and the arrival of the Speckwa, the Blue Heron Canoe family at the Heiltsuk Nation in Bella Bella, BC, on tribal canoe journeys in 2014.
I want you to be aware, though, that we're seeing video of you from your webcam, but we are not seeing any of your screen yet.
We're not seeing the screen. Oh, well, there we go. Let me, there we go. How's that coming up now?
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks for noting that there. Okay, let's see. So again, I've taken about 15 years off from Sunstone, and that's primarily been because of my relationship with the Stahopes and other Coast Salish nations. I've been working on running an environmental anthropology field school where we focus on ecological restoration and reculturation events in partnership with Coast Salish nations, getting college students involved in those. And the travel canoe journey has been a key part of that. I would also like to acknowledge all of my ancestors, my Mormon heritage, which comes from the Western and Northern Europe via Canada, Mexico, and the United States. These are settler colonists, as well as my indigenous ancestry from the Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk and the Stahopes or Snohomish peoples, the latter being by adoption. I'd also like to acknowledge the Haudenosaunee, the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora. And I'd like to acknowledge the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, who hosted a seminar on American Indian and Mormon history a few years ago, at which I first presented the ideas in this paper that I'm summarizing today and a publication that they subsequently published in a book through the University of Utah Press called Essays on American Indian and Mormon History. My chapter, number 2, is titled Other Scriptures, Restoring Voices of Gantuisas, that's the clan mothers, to an Open Canon. And today's presentation is based in part on that chapter, as well as additional material that I've uncovered in the interim that's from a book I'm working on going into this topic in more depth. I'd also like to thank the reviewers of that manuscript, Carrie Sumner Murphy, my wife, the editors, P. Jane Hafen and Brendan Rensink, and other authors who reviewed my essay, Stanley Thane, Michael Taylor, and Lori Taylor, as well as anonymous reviewers from the University of Utah Press. My presentation here is going to focus on elements that are missing from the Book of Mormon, in particular, the grief, gratitude, and the elements of that are present in the Haudenosaunee story of the Great Peace. I'm going to make a series of steps in my argument. The first is that indigenous places, Ganagwe, Ganargwa, and Ganondagan, gave birth to Mormonism. That Mormonism came from indigenous places. Second, that the Book of Mormon is a self-consciously, culturally bound and incomplete settler colonial text, not an indigenous history. While Indians are mostly absent from the stories that Mormons tell, Haudenosaunee were not absent in fact from the origins of Mormonism. There are significant 19th century parallels between Haudenosaunee oral traditions and Mormonism that include, among several other things, an association of the Peacemaker with Jesus. The differences between the two cultural traditions, though, are more interesting than the similarities. And these disjunctions are key to decolonizing Mormonism. By paying attention to the differences as well as the parallels, we can better understand indigenous perspectives on Mormonism. The Mother of Nations in Iyanwata, or Hiawatha, as the name is anglicized, are absent from the Book of Mormon's account of the Peacemaker. Grief and gratitude were central to the missing teachings of the Peacemaker, Iyanwata, and the Mother of Nations. And Ganondagan, just a dozen miles away from Hilkamora, is a sacred place, remembered as the residence of the Mother of Nations. For those not familiar with indigenous geography, I want to introduce you to the lands of the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee historical lands include Western New York and surrounding areas. The original 5 nations were the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk. The Tuscarora would join later during the historical period. Let's take a closer look at the Haudenosaunee lands in the Palmyra area, where the Book of Mormon allegedly came from. The city of Palmyra is in an indigenous place. Ganagwe is the Seneca community that is a historic village site that not only hosted a community or a town there, in the past, but was regularly visited throughout the founding events of the Book of Mormon. You see a creek running from Palmyra to the southeast. That's Ganargua, or Mud Creek, which may be an anglicized version of Ganagwe. And that was a critical resource area for Haudenosaunee, or Seneca people to be more specific. And in the corner, the bottom left corner, you see Ganondagan. Ganondagan is a 17th century, or was during the 17th century, the largest Seneca village in the area, and would play important critical functions in Haudenosaunee tradition, including those related to the Mother of Nations. Hilkamora, you see kind of in between those in the blue circle in the screen. The Book of Mormon, I'm arguing, is culturally bound and incomplete, and self-consciously so. We can use to illustrate that the passages where Jesus chastises the Nephites for not including the teachings of Samuel the Lamanite. In fact, he said, "Behold, other scriptures I would that ye should write, that ye have not." Scriptures that are unwritten, we might think. In fact, there are several references to unwritten scripture. Many things that Jesus taught that were not written, many things that Samuel the Lamanite taught that were not written. Perhaps an allusion to oral tradition. Also, the Book of Mormon acknowledged in its title page in 1830, where Joseph Smith identified himself as author and proprietor, that there may be mistake of men in the scripture itself. And finally, the Nephi, the earlier Nephi, taught that divinity informs humanity unto our own understanding, that we interpret things in our language and according to our understanding. In other words, that scripture is culturally bound. It's limited to a cultural perspective. And critical to that cultural perspective in Mormonism is a settler colonial worldview of Joseph Smith and his contemporaries, that is the immigrants from Europe. From the same book where my article comes from, the Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, there's an excellent article opening the book by the Dakota scholar Elise Boxer called The Book of Mormon as Mormon Settler Colonialism. In my opinion, this is one of the best articles I've seen on the Book of Mormon, and I encourage everyone to take the time to read it. She makes the strong case and states very bluntly that the Book of Mormon is not indigenous history. The Book of Mormon is not just a reflection of Mormon settler colonialism, but has been used to create a discourse that silences indigenous voices and perspectives regarding their own history. It isn't just the Book of Mormon text itself that is the problem. It's the way that we as Mormons use the text that perpetuates settler colonialism. Well, what is settler colonialism, you might wonder? Well, settler colonial states are those that seek not just to extract resources and labor from indigenous nations like other colonial powers, but to remove the people and to permanently settle the land. Settler colonialism is an ongoing process, not a single event. There's an initial invasion that's followed by oppressive social structures, re-education, suppression of indigenous traditions, false constructions of settler belonging, and the elimination or absorption of indigenous peoples. Each of these offenses, if you will, of settler colonialism are part of the Book of Mormon and Mormon practice. In the words of the Mohawk scholar Tayaki Alfred, the crime of colonialism is present today, as are its perpetrators. Mormon missionaries are those perpetrators. Indigenous people were present in the founding events of the Book of Mormon. 5,100 Haudenosaunee were living in New York in 1829, but are nearly absent from Mormon records at the time. Yet local historians recount a frequent presence in Ganargua Valley and the surrounding areas through at least the 1850s. One of the reasons for this is the Haudenosaunee retained hunting and fishing rights in the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua, signed just south of Manchester, and in a variety of land transactions in the area. So Haudenosaunee did not give up the right to continue to harvest, to hunt, and to fish in these areas that the settlers were occupying. And they continued to do that and continue to do so to this day. Several Seneca and other Haudenosaunee would return to Palmyra and neighboring communities during the founding events of the Book of Mormon, often for several days or weeks at a time. Those individuals named in local histories and newspapers include people like Hot Red, Tommy Jimmy, Captain Thompson, Blackbird, Old Blue Sky, John Sky, Jacob Jameson, Red Jacket, William Sky, Peter Smoke, and 20 Canoes. So we have a number of named individuals who are coming to the communities in Palmyra and the surrounding communities and interacting with the settler colonists. In fact, Red Jacket, pictured here, gave a speech at the Palmyra Academy in July of 1822. He was on his way to visit with Quakers, or perhaps on his return, and shared his perspective about stopping abuses by Christian missionaries who were violating restrictions on their proselytizing and seeking the assistance of Quakers, which, even though they were missionaries themselves, they did not proselytize. And so he was seeking their assistance and gave a speech in the process. Of course, Lori Taylor, who also has an article in the same book as Elise Boxer and myself, has done some excellent work on this presentation by Red Jacket that also appears in that book. But even before the Smith family got to New York, they interacted with Native people. In fact, over 3 generations of the Smith family were involved in one way or another with Dartmouth College and Moore's Charity School, founded by Eliezer Wheelock. In fact, Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith's brother, between 1811 and 1816, attended Moore's Charity School, and he had at least 8 known Native classmates. These include Lewis Langford, who was Mohawk, James Stevenson, Seneca, Jacob Jameson, Seneca, Simon Anance, Abenaki, John with an unknown last name, who's Saratoga, John Wheel, Stockbridge or Mohawk, John Whalebone, who's Seneca, and John Alexander with an unknown tribal affiliation. Notice that in those names, that Jacob Jameson appears there twice. He appears as a regular visitor to the communities surrounding Palmyra, particularly to Canandaigua. Jacob Jameson was an interpreter for the United States and worked under the direction of Jasper Parrish, who lived in Canandaigua. And in fact, Jacob Jameson, the office where Jasper Parrish worked was just a few doors, the office where Jacob Jameson's grandmother published a book, her autobiography, in 1824, was just a few doors down from the property office where the Smith family paid their mortgages, and where Joseph and his brother Hiram regularly visited along with their father to help pay those bills. Did they continue to interact with Jacob Jameson or others during those trips? If so, the Mormon records don't tell us that. Not just in New York and New Hampshire, but also in Pennsylvania, Joseph Smith and his family were interacting with indigenous people. Indigenous women, here we can find in the historical record, they were described as swarthy and married to settlers, and they lived in the Susquehanna Valley communities where the Smith family searched for treasure in 1825 to 1826. Two of the names I've been able to find in the historical record include an old Mrs. Tucker and a widow Youngs. Widow Youngs is of particular importance to me because this is my 7th generation grandmother. Her full name is Susanna Ferguson Youngs. She was born in the village, the Mohawk town of Tiononderoga on the Mohawk River, and as an adult moved to Ortega in the Susquehanna Valley with her settler husband, John Youngs. And it's in this area that Joseph Smith was engaged in treasure hunting. A local historian recorded Joseph Smith Jr. tracking down a straggling Indian who was passing up to the Susquehanna, who had told of buried treasure, and inducing him to reveal the place where it was buried. So at least in one of his treasure hunts, he was directed to the supposed treasure by a native person himself. Intriguingly, while digging in this particular case, Joseph Smith attempted to sacrifice a white dog, but substituted instead a sheep in a failed attempt to break an enchantment protecting the treasure. That white dog is of particular interest to those of us who understand Haudenosaunee tradition, because the sacrifice of white dogs, a white dog or white dogs, is an ancient practice in Haudenosaunee communities that had kind of fallen out of favor in the 18th century, but around the start of the 19th century was revived by a series of prophets, including the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake, who advocated the sacrifice of a white dog. This was also of particular interest to people associated with Moore's Charity School. Some of the graduates of Moore's Charity School, Joseph Brant, who was Mohawk, and Samuel Kirkland, who was a missionary to the Oneida, had discourse about the return of this white dog sacrifice in the Oneida community, and sought assistance from Moore's Charity School in Dartmouth to bring in more missionaries to counteract these, what they called pagan traditions. Also, one of those missionaries who came was a man by the name of Ethan Smith, the same Ethan Smith that wrote a book called The View of the Hebrews. Ethan Smith, in his View of the Hebrews, notes the white dog ceremonies as well. And saw them as evidence of the degeneration of ancient Hebrew traditions, and portrayed the sacrifice of a white dog similar to animal sacrifices. Actually, in the context of Haudenosaunee traditions, they said the sacrifice of white dogs had nothing to do with sin in the sense that the ancient Hebrews would have thought of it. While searching for treasure at the yeoman's property in Otago, New York, Smith consulted a seer stone in a hat and saw, according to a testimony in the Bainbridge trial by a friendly source, that is, someone providing evidence in favor of Joseph Smith, said that two Indians who had buried the trunk, Joseph Smith looked into his hat and saw two Indians who had buried a trunk, and that a quarrel ensued between them, and that one of the said Indians was killed by the other and thrown into the hole beside the trunk to guard it. So we do have references to Joseph Smith interacting with dead Indians, even though the living Indians were there as well. We also know that Joseph Smith and his contemporaries interacted through native artifacts. Pictured on this screen, you'll see a spindle whorl in the upper right corner that Joseph Smith found near Nauvoo, Illinois, and used as a seer stone. Gorgets used by the Whitmer brothers are pictured in the middle, and an exotic stone in the bottom right, the one that the LDS church now acknowledges Joseph Smith used in the translation of the Book of Mormon, is similar to the Ulliuntsuti of the Cherokee. The Cherokee are an Iroquois-speaking culture that had some traditions similar to that of the Haudenosaunee, involving the use of stones for divination purposes. James Adair and Elias Boudinette, two advocates of the idea that Indians were lost tribes of Israel, called these Ulliuntsuti an Urim and Thummim, a name that ought to sound familiar to those interested in Mormonism, a term that Joseph Smith also used for his seer stones. Well, while non-Mormon historical records indicate the presence of indigenous people in New Hampshire, New York, and Pennsylvania, they are generally absent from the stories that Mormons tell about their origins. When present, though, Smith portrays indigenous people as dead and white, people like Moroni, Nephi, Mormon, or those two Indians buried with the trunk, thereby erasing those living Indians who are actually present. Laurie Taylor's chapter in Essays on American Indian and Mormon History includes a fascinating story told by Nicholas Vorman of how followers of the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake helped Joseph Smith with the construction of the Book of Mormon. I don't have time here to relate the whole story, but the basics of the story are that two followers of Handsome Lake, working together with Joseph Smith as farm laborers, assisted him, taught him a little bit about Haudenosaunee tradition, assisted him in constructing plates, gold tablets, inscribed with pictographs from the Seneca tradition. And then Joseph Smith pretended to find and translate those. Taylor asserts that this story goes back to at least the 1960s and identifies the Tuscarora activist Wallace Mad Bear Anderson as a prolific teller of the story. Now, Mad Bear shows up in some interesting places as well in the 1970s in Utah, where he participated in a number of rallies and protests, one of which occurred on Temple Square in front of the General Conference in April of 1974, when he called for the repatriation of the skulls held by the LDS Church Museum at that time in Temple Square. When we take this story and look at it, Laurie is not able to confirm that going beyond that time, but the story does have a few key elements that we can confirm. For example, the story asserts an indigenous presence in Mormon origins. And Laurie, and I've added to that, her research very well demonstrates that, and I've summarized that up till now. It also provides an affinity, or asserts an affinity between the two traditions. And that's very much the case as well, except that Smith's version, according to the Nicholas Vorman version of the story, is too Christian. And I would agree with that. Interesting third part is that we can't verify yet, but is the assertion that Joseph Smith repatriated the gold tablets to the Seneca. What we have here happening in story is what Mad Bear Anderson advocated happen in reality in Utah, that is the repatriation of things stolen from indigenous peoples. So maybe Mad Bear had occurred in his stories of what he couldn't have occur in reality. There is some indication the story may be older. There's an historian, C. Stanley Banks, who wrote in 1945, asserted that tradition has it that the prophet Joseph Smith, in his authorship of the Book of Mormon, was greatly influenced by a study of the beliefs of the Iroquois Indians of New York. Unfortunately, Banks doesn't give us a lot of detail about where he found this or heard this information. And so more work is needed. A few years later, an essayist and journalist, Edmund Wilson, was interviewing a number of different Haudenosaunee, and he interviewed one by the name of Philip Cook, who was a Mohawk and Mormon, who said that, and Wilson says about Philip Cook, that he thought at first that Joseph Smith must have been influenced by the Handsome Lake doctrine through the Senecas of Western New York, but then he concluded that no white man at the time could have ever had access to their ceremonies or understood what was said if they had. I'm not so sure I would jump quickly to that conclusion that Philip Cook does, but for him, this was a faith-affirming observation. And I think the question about Joseph Smith's access is one that I'm actively investigating, and some of the details are shared here. But let's take a closer look at some of the proposed parallels between Haudenosaunee and Mormon traditions. An early scholarship on this was by Ake Strom, who had contended that there are strong red Indian elements in early Mormonism based on his analysis of Algonquian speakers rather than Iroquoian speakers. Laurie Taylor, in her dissertation in 2000, and in the article in this book, finds similarities in the visions of Handsome Lake, Joseph Smith Sr., and Lehi. She notes the burial of weapons as a renunciation of war occurs in both traditions. She notes resemblances between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Council of 50, which, for example, both have 50 members, health restrictions, similarities in ceremony, and similarities in origin stories. Historian Matthew Dennis observed that both the Seneca and Mormon prophets responded to denominational rivalry, had revelations that emanated from sacred dreams, and wrestled with profound economic change associated with the national and international market economy. John Larson here at the Salt Lake City Sunstone in 2012 argued The description of Lamanites portrayed in the Book of Mormon is consistent with 19th century understandings of the Iroquois and the archaeological interpretation of artifacts commonly found in New York State area during the time the Book of Mormon was produced. Former BYU librarian Rick Grunder notes similarities between names, Oneida in the Book of Mormon and the nation of Oneida, Onondagas in a Joseph Smith revelation about Zelph, a skeleton looted by Mormons in Illinois, and the Onondaga Nation of the Haudenosaunee. He also notes Handsome Lake's accounts of Jesus and those in the Book of Mormon, his three messengers, and that is Handsome Lake's three messengers and the three Nephites, the white dog sacrifices, and similarities between the Mohegan preacher Samson Occam and Samuel the Lamanite. Peter Manseau noted most of the parallels listed above and wrote, while the birth of Mormonism is often considered in relation to other Second Great Awakening movements, in fact, the similarities pale in comparison to all that Smith's religious visions had in common with those of Handsome Lake. More recently, in the new book, Americanist Approaches to the Book of Mormon, Nancy Bentley has proposed that Smith shared with Handsome Lake questions of kinship, as well as similar ideas about ancient Indian prophets, the voices of dead warriors, visions of tragic removals and defeats, and an imperative to save for posterity the culture and spirituality of America's original inhabitants. So there's a lot of scholarly interest, at least especially in recent years, in these parallels. But the parallels only tell part of the story. The differences are equally, if not more important. And from a decolonizing perspective, if we're better to understand indigenous perspectives on Mormonism, the differences are paramount. In fact, the settler colonial text of the Book of Mormon basically culturally appropriates and thereby distorts indigenous concepts and ideas. So if we really want to understand those concepts and ideas in their original context, we need to be in dialogue with indigenous peoples. In fact, in her afterword to the excellent book, Decolonizing Mormonism, the Taos Pueblo scholar, P. Jane Hafen, argues that listening to natives tell their own stories about their origins is a decolonizing act. So in my article, Other Scriptures, I draw significantly from three books that are pictured here, one by Tom Porter, a Mohawk elder, and Grandma Said, Iroquois Teachings as Passed Down Through the Oral Tradition, and a couple of books by Barbara Alice Mann, a scholar of Seneca descent, Iroquois and Women, the Gantuisas, and Native Americans, Archaeologists, and the Mounds. All three of which I highly recommend to those who might be interested in learning more on these topics from indigenous perspectives. Now what I want to do is go through some of these proposed parallels and look at them not just as similarities, but also through their differences. We'll start with dreams and visions. Haudenosaunee and Mormon dreams and visions share several features. The idea that dreams might, or visions might have revelatory power, that might convey messages from the divine or the creator. The idea of dream interpretation. The idea of solitary teenage vision quests in natural settings, like Joseph Smith's Sacred Grove vision, very similar to a vision quest. In the visions themselves, I often see sky journeys, which are a characteristic motif in Haudenosaunee traditions, guides. In the case of Handsome Lake, the Seneca prophet, he has three messengers that appear as guides, divergent paths, one wide and one narrow, that in Haudenosaunee traditions are reflective of the Milky Way, where the dead go after they pass. And in the book, in the Lehi, Handsome Lake, and Joseph Smith Sr. visions, there are very specific details, things like mansions, trees, fruits, and family reunification that appear in these dreams and visions. So those are suggestive that perhaps one influenced the other, or probably the more likely scenario is that they came from a common cultural tradition that was multicultural and intercultural. But let's take a look at the differences as well. The Haudenosaunee differences of particular importance are that women played a prominent role as the dream workers, as the interpreters of dreams. Women, the clan matrons or the gantuisas, would place the dream within a social context. And in the process, they would emphasize to the dreamer how they might satisfy or resolve their fears and wishes that are expressed in those dreams through their actions. And that was an important part of the dream work and remains so to this day. Haudenosaunee also approached dreams and visions a little more skeptical and humbly than do Mormons, who see absolute and divine truth coming unfiltered oftentimes through dreams and visions. We can take a look at a few examples to illustrate these differences. When Lehi shares his dream with his family in the Book of Mormon, the skeptical approaches of Sariah, Laman, and Lemuel are dismissed in Nephi's account in favor of that of the patriarch. If this had been a Haudenosaunee situation, it would have been Sariah's interpretation. It would have been her role as the clan mother to provide the context and help Lehi to understand what fears and wishes his dream was expressing and how he might deal with them constructively. Tom Porter, the Mohawk elder, warns, it's much, much easier not to have to find knowledge from dreams or from trying to make yourself sensitive to those things. It's much easier just to listen to a grandma or grandpa who knows. When knowledge comes from a dream, you never know if it's real or not. When he has to depend upon a dream for information, he qualifies it, saying things like, all I know is that that's what the spirits told me at the time. And I don't know if they were trying to trick me or if it's really true, but it sounds like it's logical. What if Mormons took the same approach to their dreams and visions? A little more skepticism instead of proclaiming that one seeming answer to a prayer makes a book a historical document. Another parallel that's worth diving into a little more deeply is that of sibling rivalry. While Haudenosaunee traditions of sapling and flint and Book of Mormon stories of Nephi and Laman differ in more than they share, they have a number of common themes that include sibling rivalry itself. Both stories are part of broader migration narratives. For sapling and flint, it's their grandmother, Sky Woman, who comes from the sky world down to Turtle Island, and they are subsequently born from her daughter, Mother Earth, or the Earth Mother. In the case of Nephi and Laman, they and their family come from Jerusalem in the Old World to what they perceive as a New World. In both traditions, the brothers contend in life, through their actions in life, but also through their dreams, that the dreams are an important part of that contention. In each tradition, one brother is bound by another. One makes a bow and an arrow in each story, and one makes a water vessel in each tradition, a boat or a ship, a canoe or a ship. The brothers employ navigational aids in both traditions, and one brother is associated with light and the other with dark. And intriguingly, in the Book of Mormon, Nephi reports that the followers of Laman had hardened their hearts and become like unto a flint. Is that a reference to flint of the Haudenosaunee tradition or just a coincidence? Well, let's look at the differences. In the Haudenosaunee traditions, this sibling rivalry is seen more as complementary and cooperative rather than a battle between good and evil as it's portrayed in the Book of Mormon. Haudenosaunee traditions emphasize reciprocity, mutuality, and interdependence. And they have the prominence of Sky Woman and Mother Earth, prominent female figures that are missing from the Nephi and Laman story. And in the Haudenosaunee traditions, light and dark do not refer to skin color. Now, how did all these similarities maybe get there? Well, over 400 years of Christian influence, some Haudenosaunee traditions have evolved to incorporate foreign ideas. Now, it's important to acknowledge that about 200 of that Christian influence occurred before the events of Joseph Smith producing the Book of Mormon, and about 200 years of evolution after Joseph Smith produced the Book of Mormon. because most of the parallels that appear between Haudenosaunee traditions and Mormonism come from the Christianized versions of Haudenosaunee oral tradition, we need to take that Christian influence into account. And some of the parallels may very well have come before the Book of Mormon, some may have come after. But some of those foreign ideas that are incorporated into Haudenosaunee tradition include the idea of a great spirit that also appears in the Book of Mormon, concepts of heaven and hell that we learned from the opening address, weren't around at the time Lehi was around, but developed later in Christian thought, good and evil. Those concepts were foreign to Haudenosaunee traditions. In fact, Barbara Alice Mann, the Seneca scholar, it's the Seneca descendant scholar, says that recasting the twins as the Christian God and devil, as many Christian missionaries did, was undoubtedly the most common or most destructive manipulation of the sky tradition after the expulsion of women from creation. Separating the twins from one another to present them as enemies cruelly betrayed the true meaning of bonded relationship. For Flint was not a destroyer, nor sapling a lone creator. Instead, both twins were creators of life abundant, as were their female elders before them. Tom Porter warns us that we don't like to refer to the twins as good and evil. He self-identifies as a pagan, not a Christian. He says, we just credit one with making nice things that help us, and the other always made mischievous things, much like a prankster. Mann continues that the twins are collaborators who between them brought forth the exhilarating and fruitful mixtures of the benign and the dangerous, the funny and the grave, the frightening and the comforting that constitute the human world. They basically adjust for each other's tendency to go too far in his own direction. In this respect, Flint completes sapling, just as sapling reciprocates Flint. What if Mormons adopted an approach more like that than seeing Nephi and Laman as polar opposites, one good and one evil? The next parallel I want to focus on is, of course, one of the most prominent, that is that of the Great Peace. The appearance of Jesus, followed by 2 centuries of peace and equality in ancient America, is the climax of the Book of Mormon. This narrative apogee is the most compelling of the proposed parallels between Haudenosaunee and Mormon traditions. The Great Peace appears to be the only event in the Book of Mormon corroborated by external sources. Yet Haudenosaunee oral traditions complicate the Mormon narrative. The Peacemaker's appearance likely came later than the Book of Mormon claims. The peace was less utopian than depicted, lasted longer than claimed, and included Iroquois and a mother of nations. And in fact, the women's roles in that peace are strikingly absent from the Book of Mormon. The women, for example, were what we would call maybe property owners. They were the ones that controlled the property. And they also were like the electorate. They were the ones who elected the peace chiefs. And so women exclusively had the vote. Men did not have a vote. The peace chiefs were like the federal, if you compare it to our government, they were like the federal government. But the matrons, the contuisas, were the local government. But they were also the Supreme Court because they could veto any of the decisions of the men. And they also had the power to remove the men from office if they disagreed with their decisions. Those are all missing, of course, from the Book of Mormon. The Peacemaker, Iroquois, and the Mother of Nations are credited with founding this Democratic League of Nations. And most non-native scholars date the founding of the Confederacy between 1450 and 1550 of the Common Era, or AD. Barbara Alice Mann and her co-author Jerry Fields, an astronomer, date the founding to an appearance of a comet on August 31st, 1142 of the Common Era. Whichever of these traditions you might agree with, neither of them falls within the time frame of the Book of Mormon. I will note that though there is a minority tradition among some Haudenosaunee who are influenced by Christianity that put these events in a time frame more compatible with the Book of Mormon, because of stories like this one that Tom Porter shared. Porter learned from his grandmother about a baby born to an unmarried woman, along with 11 other babies born to married women. The 11 were drawn to the fatherless child who became a teacher and a seer. The teacher shared the Thanksgiving address, the clan system, and 4 sacred rituals, a couple of songs, a couple of dances, a song, and a game. He then left across this big water, saying there's another people. They're different from us, meaner than the people here, more violent, the killing going on there in more need than here. So he left. In old age, the 11 birthmates were drawn magnetically to the shore from which the teacher had walked across the sea. They greeted him as he returned. The peacemaker displayed his wounds, including holes in his chest, hands, and feet. He sadly reported, they don't want peace. He told how they had rejected his message and murdered him. You didn't hurt me when I was here. Thank you. You opened yourselves and you embraced the Creator's teachings, and you gave me honor. Notice in the Haudenosaunee traditions, the peacemaker validates the culture, the indigenous culture, does not repudiate it. I want to take a little more look, given the themes of this conference, at 2 elements of the messages of the peacemaker that are missing from the Book of Mormon. The first is the Thanksgiving address. And for this, I'm going to rely on a short video clip from the Onondaga Historical Society. In it, you'll see, they're not listed by name, but you'll see Tom Porter, you'll see Orrin Lyons, Sid Hill or Tanadaho from the Seneca, from the Onondaga, excuse me. You'll also see one of my favorite authors, Robin Wall Kimmerer, in this video clip. She's Potawatomi rather than Haudenosaunee, but has excellent perspectives. And Potawatomi have a similar tradition. Whoops. Let me go back and try that again.
The Thanksgiving address is one of the most important parts of our culture that can be conveyed to the outside world. The Thanksgiving address is an address. It is not a prayer. We are actually, with our language, speaking to those parts of creation and thanking them, and then having the whole gathering send that thanksgiving out to those parts of creation.
It lays our relationship to the universe of how we're to behave and how to respect the universe we live in.
It's a directive, and it's also a summation of our cosmology. It tells us in the beginning to be respectful, to be thankful. And that's where the idea of Thanksgiving comes in.
The Thanksgiving address is such a beautiful oration. I think of it as just this river of words that takes us to an orientation of gratitude. It reminds us to acknowledge that we're not alone in the world, that our very lives are dependent upon the gifts of all of these other beings with whom we share the planet.
Any gathering we have, whether it's a large one or a small one, whether it's a meeting of the Council of Chiefs or whether it's ceremony or a clan meeting, the Thanksgiving address is put out before all.
One of the parts of it that I think is so powerful is that cadence that says, let us bring our minds together as one. I think we can think about the Thanksgiving address as an example of native science. In a way, it is a listing of all of the elements of the ecosystem.
Start with the Ganohanyu, we call the Thanksgiving address. The words before all else. You give thanks for the people around you, that we're all here, and we're healthy, we're able to be here. And you give thanks for the Mother Earth, all the things that she provides for us. And then we go into the things that the Creator has set down here for us.
You're thankful for water, for the corn and all the vegetation, the trees, the sun, we call it our older brother, the moon.
To the animals running about, to the berries, to the birds, and kindly and respectfully we put our minds together as one and give a great gratitude.
So we talk about the soft winds, soft winds that bring the seasons. When you talk about the thundering beings, the thundering voices, we call our grandfathers, and we call the winds our grandfathers. Personify them. Respect them. We love them.
And so we continue on in that model of Thanksgiving in our ceremonies throughout the year.
Well, the ceremonies are part of the acknowledgement. It all relates to the Thanksgiving address. It all relates to the work that the Creator has put in to Mother Earth.
Because we're dependent on everything. That's why we keep our ceremonies going, to say thank you for the gifts of life every day.
It takes you to that place of thanksgiving, and everyone has that place where you're feeling that feeling of being grateful for what you have.
It's a renewal, it's a continuation, great authority, great instruction, good values.
All right, if I can get out of here, let's see. Oh, come on. Hang on here. There we go. Okay. So that shows you from several leading members of the Haudenosaunee Nation and friends what the Thanksgiving address is like and what is missing from the accounts of the Book of Mormon. The condolence ceremony is also a key part of the Peacemaker's message that is not present in the Book of Mormon. In the stories of the founding of the League, Hiawatha suffers a series of tragic losses of his spouse and children. Despondent, he retreats to a place of seclusion near the shore. Ducks lift the water and with their wings reveal the shells of whelks and clams from which he fashions beads of wampum. He introduces a ceremony in which members of one clan, moiety, or tribe condole those of another. The condolers wipe away the tears from the eyes of the mourners, unstop their ears, and clear their throats with strings of wampum that they pass back and forth across the fire. The intent is to address the loss and bring the people together as one mind to move forward collectively in their endeavors. Condolence ceremonies are a critical component of the Confederacy and the means by which clan mothers stand up new peace chiefs to take the place of those who have passed prior to the reconvening of the League for treaties or other business. As an illustration, I'm going to read to you a slightly modified condolence address written by the Mohawk teacher Ray Fadden, or Tehana Torrens, for those who write about Indians. And we might include Mormons and Joseph Smith in those who write about Indians. We hold in our hands 14 strings of purple wampum. These we hand one by one to you, authors of many American history books, writers of cheap, inaccurate, unauthentic, sensational novels, and other writers of fiction and scripture who have poisoned the minds of young Americans concerning our people, the Oklahoma, the original people. To the producers of many Western cowboy and Indian television programs and moving picture shows, to those treaty breakers who delighted in dispossessing Indian peoples by constructing dams on Indian lands in violation of sacred treaties, and to those of this, our country, who are prone to build up the glory of their ancestors on the bonds and lifeblood of our old people. With this first string of wampum, we take away the fog that surrounds your eyes and obstruct your view, that you may see the truth concerning our people. With this second string of wampum, we pull away from your imprisoned mind the cobwebs, the net that prevents you from dealing justice to our people. With this third piece of wampum, we cleanse your hearts of revenge, selfishness, and injustice, that you may create love instead of hate. With this fourth string of wampum, we wash the blood of our people from your hands, that you may know the clasp of true friendship and sincerity. With this fifth string of wampum, we shrink your heads down to that of normal humans. We cleanse your minds of the abnormal conceit and love of self that has caused you to walk blindly among the dark people of the world. With this sixth string of wampum, we remove your garments of gold, silver, and greed, and you may don the apparel of generosity, hospitality, and humanity. With the seventh string of wampum, We remove the dirt that fills your ears so you may hear the story and truth of our people. With the 8th string of wampum, we straighten your tongues of crookedness, that in the future you may speak the truth concerning Oklahoma. With this 9th string of wampum, we take away the dark clouds from the face of the sun, that its rays may purify your thoughts, that you may look forward and see America instead of backward towards Europe. With the 10th string of wampum, we brush away the rough stones and sticks from your path, that you may walk erect as the first American whose name you have defamed and whose country you now occupy. With the 11th string of wampum, we take away from your hands your implements of destruction, guns, bombs, firewater, diseases, and place in them instead the pipe of friendship and peace, that you may sow love rather than bitter hate and injustice. With this 12th string of wampum, we build you a new house with many windows and no mirrors, that you may look out and see the life and purpose of your nearest neighbor, the American Indian. With this 13th string of wampum, we tear down the wall of steel and stone you have built around the tree of peace, that you may take shelter beneath its branches. With this 14th string of wampum, we take from the hen coop the eagle that you have imprisoned, that this noble bird may once again fly in the sky over America. I, Tehanatorans, say this. You have now been condoled for telling lies about Indians. I'd like to come full circle back to Ganondagan and the Mother of Nations. A dozen miles from Hilcomora sits sacred land. The land around Ganondagan and Ganargua Creek was the source of significant looting of indigenous artifacts and graves by settlers in the region, especially those first couple of generations of settlers that included the Smith family and many other founders of Mormonism. They found European trade goods interspersed with indigenous artifacts that Joseph Smith apparently confused with an ancient white nation of Nephites. Ganondagan, the largest Seneca village from the 17th century, has important historical associations with the Mother of Nations. The title, the Mother of Nations, belongs to the Wolf clan of the Seneca Nation, is passed down over generations. The grave of a woman who Haudenosaunee believe was one of the holders of the hereditary title was breached and examined by settlers before the protections now provided by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. I'd like to share a short clip telling from the perspective of the Haudenosaunees interpreting at the Ganondagan State Historical Site, their perspective.
My name is Michael Galvin. I'm the curator here at Ganondagan at Seneca Art and Culture Center. And today we're going to focus on a story that is associated with Ganondagan. And many people have heard bits and pieces of it, but it really reflects on the association that we have with someone very important to Haudenosaunee people, and by extension, really should be a person who's very influential and important to the people of America, North America, or we'll say the United States of America, really. And that person is, we can refer to her as the Mother of Nations, or we can use her name sparingly. Her name is Jigon-Sasen. This woman had a great impact on the way that Haudenosaunee people regarded the division and the sharing of responsibility and leadership in their communities and in the greater culture of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And she has a direct link to Ganondagan, but in a way which I think some people might find interesting. So there was a holder of that name who existed at the time of the great peace for Haudenosaunee people. And she lived and functioned over towards the Great Falls at Niagara. And that story is epic, and there's no way I could tell it to you in 10 minutes. But I would look at a source called The White Roots of Peace by Wallace. That would tell you that story to check out. So there's some reading for you. But that person, that individual existed so long ago, way before the time of Ganondagan. So the town of Ganondagan was here sometime, people started to live here in this area sometime in the mid-1650s. And we can be sure that by about 1675, this town was in full swing, long after the Haudenosaunee had confederated and established a way of living and life which has sustained them even till today. So the time of Ganondagan, there was a person who lived here, and she came to live here in this area because of conflict which occurred between one of the Western nations and the Seneca people. And to make that kind of simple, in simple terms, a war took place, and people from that nation, the neutral peoples, some of them were brought here. And when they were brought here, a woman who held a similar position and responsibility as the original Jigonsase, now the inheritor of the name, was brought here. And they say that she was in a town that just north of us here near Bloomfield. That's where she was brought and incorporated into Seneca people. She was folded into the Wolf clan, and that is where the name resides, with the Wolf clan of the Seneca people. Again, another reason why people associate.
So we'll stop the video at that point in the interest of time. But I do want to point out a couple of key things. One, there was, in fact, a great battle at Ganondagan. This battle did not occur in 400 AD. Instead, it occurred in 1687, and it was a French invasion of the town that occurred when most of the men were away, and it was the Mother of Nations who led the children to fight the French. Not very successfully, I might add, but to defend the community the best that they could under the circumstances. The remnants of that battle were scattered throughout the Ganargwa Valley and were often uncovered by settlers such as the Smith family, and may very well have given rise to Joseph Smith's ideas that there was once a great battle in the valley near Hilkamora. In summary, the apogee of the Book of Mormon, the great peace of the Haudenosaunee, may be the only event in the scripture to be validated by external sources. The Mormon account displaces the founding of the League in time, conflates Jesus with the Peacemaker, presents a more utopian image than evidence warrants, fails to credit or consider Haudenosaunee accounts, and neglects female founders such as Sky Woman, Mother Earth, and the Mother of Nations in an androcentric, patriarchal, settler colonial narrative. Yet the Book of Mormon's own self-conscious awareness of its cultural limitations and incompleteness provides Mormons with a useful tool for decolonizing the faith. Mormons of indigenous heritage can reclaim for ourselves the other scriptures mentioned by Jesus, oral traditions of Sky Woman, and the founding of the Great League of the Haudenosaunee provide a more complete story and correct the misperceptions contained in a settler colonial scripture. Gratitude and reciprocity need to replace selfishness and injustice. Thankfulness for all creation and all of our relations builds more reciprocal abundance. As listeners, you have been condoled for the sin of telling misleading and untruthful stories about indigenous peoples. The founding events of Mormonism occurred in indigenous places. Indigenous people, especially Seneca and other Haudenosaunee, were and still are present in the places now claimed and occupied by settler colonialists. The Book of Mormon is a product of Joseph Smith's discourse with the dead through dreams and visions, or so he told us. Dreams and visions can provide no more than a murky view of the past that should be approached skeptically. Haudenosaunee oral tradition reports that Smith also talked with living Indians, but for some reason, Mormons did not keep records of that discourse. Echoes of and allusions to Haudenosaunee traditions reverberate throughout the Book of Mormon. If Mormons are to learn to recognize and contemplate these parallels, and more importantly, the differences, we need to stop telling settler colonial stories to Indigenous Americans and take the time instead to listen to Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous teachings told in Indigenous terms by Oklahoma, the original peoples. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That was beautiful. We'd like to now begin our question and answer period. We've got several questions in here already. First, I'm going to ask, would you be willing to share your slideshow so that we can look at them closer after your presentation is finished? Maybe by making a comment with a link or...
Yeah, I can do that, and I'll put it up on my academia page as well. I had intended to do that beforehand, but I was making last-minute edits. To be honest.
Understandable. That'd be excellent. And of course, I do want to remind everyone that this has been recorded, and therefore you will be able to watch it again. We've got a question here. Do you believe that personal and family interactions with Native peoples were one of Smith's primary sources of information on this topic? Or do you believe that he was seeking primarily through secondary literature written by white Americans?
Oh, that's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to that question. In fact, I'd say that question is kind of a paramount one in the current research that I'm doing, trying to resolve that. And to explain the context for that, let's note a couple of things. Some of these parallels that appear in the Book of Mormon also appear in literature that was published before the Book of Mormon, but not all of them. In fact, probably not even a majority, although I haven't really quantified that. But it seems to me that at least a significant number, if not a majority, of those traditions I've not been able to find in written records prior to Joseph Smith. And because of that, we have to be very open to this story told by Nicholas Vorman and Mad Bear Anderson that perhaps it was orally transmitted to Joseph Smith. So that is the predominant narrative that Lori Taylor documented, and so I can't dismiss that. Even though some of the details of the story I'm not so sure about, the manufacturing of fake gold plates and that they were made of gold, but I'm not so sure I buy all the details of that story. I'm a little skeptical, but I do think that we can't rule that out because some of the most compelling parallels come in literature that isn't written down, at least to my knowledge, until after the events of the Book of Mormon. And the other thing I would add to that is that some of these parallels may not have been because of contact at all. That some of the parallels may have been the process of Christianization of Haudenosaunee tradition, both before and after the publication of the Book of Mormon. And so that's where the predominance of the parallels come from the Christianized versions of Haudenosaunee tradition, not from the older traditions, if that makes sense.
Okay, we've also got another question, a little bit about how you would label these things. Do you believe that the Book of Mormon, inspired or not, is the history of any New World people? Do you believe the Lamanites and Nephites were fictional? And do you believe that we should call what Joseph Smith did cultural appropriation or plagiarism?
Yeah, I would say that the Book of Mormon is definitely fictional. My previous research I think it's demonstrated that quite conclusively, strong enough to at least generate a response in an LDS essay on DNA in the Book of Mormon. And so I spent a number of years going through genetic evidence of Israelite contact with the Americas, and we just can't find any. It's just not there. And so, that's pretty compelling evidence that the Book of Mormon events have to be fictional. Not only that, there's just a wealth of other evidence, and I would say some of the most compelling of that is, of course, the Christian ideas that are put into ancient America before Christ ever comes. direct quotes from the New Testament and from passages in the Old Testament that weren't written at the time at the time of Lehi when he left Jerusalem. So, and then there's the archaeological evidence that the Book of Mormon has all the wrong plants, animals, and people, and that's where looking at that valley, the Ganargua Valley, is particularly interesting because those things that are present, those artifacts that are present in the Book of Mormon, are present in the Ganargua Valley, where Joseph Smith would have been exploring, and things like steel and horses and cattle and sheep and silk and glass and crops like wheat and barley, goats. Those sorts of things were present in the Ganargua Valley prior to the arrival of, or prior to the removal of the Seneca people from the valley. And so the Seneca people have been trading for 200 years with Europeans. And not only were they actually trading these items, but they preferentially buried European trade goods with the dead. And so if Joseph Smith was actually excavating graves in his own neighborhoods, then he would have encountered an abundance of European trade goods. And he could very well have mistaken those for an ancient civilization. So I definitely think the Book of Mormon is fiction, and that Nephites and Lamanites are products of Joseph Smith's imagination. And then the question of whether it's cultural appropriation or plagiarism, another excellent question. My wife, who's sitting here beside me, keeps telling me that it's plagiarism. I'm yet to be convinced of that. I need a little more evidence for that. There's definitely cultural appropriation. And there's plagiarism of the Bible, for sure. But there are what biblical scholars would call echoes and allusions to people and events of the time. I'm trying to sort out the extent of that, and that's a daunting task. I mean, it just to give you, there are several dozen versions of these Haudenosaunee traditions published, and in multiple languages, some only in manuscript form, and some before, many more after the Book of Mormon. Just taking the time to go through all of those is a daunting task, and I'm working at it, but it takes a while. So ask me again in a year.
Well, let's hope that you come back to Sunstone next summer with updated and interesting presentations. This was really great. So thank you so much for your perspectives and research, and giving us some opportunities, I think, to learn how we can better raise the voices of Native peoples. So I guess that's it. That's the end of our questions. So I'd like to remind everybody that this is recorded and that you can purchase audio in the future, as well as it will be available on the Whova app for about 3 months after the symposium. Thank you so much.
Thank you.